Just white judge finds black woman, only to learn she's the president of a foundation. Part 1. On a rainy Monday morning, Judge Henry Wilson sat tall in his courtroom. At 65 years old, with thick white hair and glasses, he ran his court with strict rules. Everyone in Millfield knew not to be late to Judge Wilson's courtroom. The small courtroom was busy as usual. People whispered quietly while waiting for their cases. The wooden benches creaked when someone moved. Old ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Case number 32, parking violation, Patricia Thompson, called out the clerk, George. A woman in her 40s walked to the front. She wore a simple black dress that had small wrinkles. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but she looked tired. Dark circles showed under her eyes. Judge Wilson looked down at his papers. Ms. Thompson, I see this is your third parking ticket this year, all in loading zones. Yes, Your Honor, but if I could just explain, Patricia began in a soft but clear voice. Judge Wilson raised his hand to stop her. The rules are clear, Ms. Thompson. Loading zones are not for regular parking. They keep businesses running and roads clear. Patricia tried again. I understand, Your Honor, but yesterday there was an emergency at the law doesn't make exceptions for busy schedules, Ms. Thompson, Judge Wilson said firmly. The fine is £200. Please pay the clerk before leaving. Patricia's shoulders dropped slightly, but she kept her head high. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. As she turned to leave, Judge Wilson noticed something in her eyes. Not anger like he often saw, something else. Disappointment, sadness. For a brief moment he felt uncomfortable, but he quickly pushed the feeling away. He had 20 more cases to hear before lunch. Later that day, Judge Wilson sat in his office. He looked at the rain falling outside his window. 40 years as a judge had taught him to be fair but firm. Rules kept society working properly. Without rules, there would be chaos. His secretary, Martha, knocked on his door. Judge Wilson, don't forget about the charity dinner tonight. Your wife called to remind you. He sighed. Thank you, Martha, I almost forgot. Judge Wilson didn't enjoy social events. Since becoming a judge, he found it hard to have normal conversations. People either wanted legal advice or were afraid to say the wrong thing. But this dinner was important to his wife, Jane. She worked with many local charities and insisted he attend. That evening, Judge Wilson put on his best suit. Jane wore a beautiful blue dress and smiled when she saw him. You look handsome, Henry, she said, fixing his tie. Do we really need to stay long? He asked. It's for a good cause, Jane reminded him gently. The Brighter Future Foundation helps hundreds of children every year. When they arrived at the Grand Hotel, the ballroom was full of the town's important people. Business owners, doctors, teachers, and politicians talked and laughed while waiters served drinks. Judge Wilson stayed close to his wife, nodding politely when people greeted him. He was counting the minutes until they could leave when the event host tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special guest tonight, the founder and president of the Brighter Future Foundation, Patricia Thompson. Judge Wilson froze. He watched as the woman he had fined that morning walked confidently to the stage. The tired look was gone. Now she stood tall in an elegant dark blue dress, her smile warm as she thanked everyone for coming. 5 years ago, I started this foundation with one goal: to give every child in our community a chance to succeed, Patricia said. Today, thanks to your support, we have helped over 2,000 children with school supplies, tutoring, and special programs. Judge Wilson felt his face grow hot. The woman he had dismissed so quickly that morning was doing incredible work for their community. He hadn't even let her explain. When their eyes met across the room, Patricia gave him a small nod before continuing her speech. In that moment, Judge Wilson realized he knew nothing about the people who stood before him each day. He only saw their mistakes, never their full stories. And for the first time in many years, he wondered if perhaps that was his biggest mistake of all. Part 2 that evening, the charity dinner at the Grand Hotel continued after Patricia's speech. Judge Wilson sat uncomfortably at his table, barely touching his chicken dinner. His wife Jane noticed something was wrong. Henry, you haven't eaten a thing. Are you feeling ill? she asked quietly. "I'm fine," he replied, but his mind was elsewhere. Across the room, Patricia Thompson moved from table to table, thanking donors and sharing stories about the children her foundation helped. The room seemed to brighten wherever she went. People leaned in to hear her speak, and their faces lit up with genuine smiles. Jane followed her husband's gaze. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she? Did you know she started the foundation after teaching in the poorest school in town for 15 years? Judge Wilson shook his head. "No, I didn't know that. Her students had such potential but so few resources. She began by buying supplies with her own money. Now look at what she's built," Jane said with admiration. Judge Wilson felt the weight of his earlier judgment grow heavier. Not only had he dismissed Patricia without listening, but he had done so to someone who was clearly a pillar of their community. When dinner ended, many guests moved to the ballroom for dancing and more conversation. Judge Wilson found himself standing alone near the dessert table, watching Patricia from a distance. He debated whether to approach her or simply leave early. "Good evening, Judge Wilson," came a voice from behind him. He turned to find Patricia standing there, a small plate of fruit in her hand. Up close, he could see the kindness in her eyes that he had missed in the courtroom. "Ms. Thompson," he said, feeling his throat tighten. I didn't realize who you were this morning. Most people who come through your courtroom aren't recognized for who they really are," she replied gently. Judge Wilson looked down at his hands. "I should have let you explain." "Would you like to hear that explanation now?" she asked. He nodded, grateful for the second chance. "Yesterday we received a call from the Children's Hospital. A young boy named Tommy was having his final cancer treatment. He loves books about space, but the hospital library had none. I was delivering a collection of space books when I parked in that loading zone. The regular parking was full because of a special event." Judge Wilson closed his eyes briefly. "I'm sorry, I should have listened. We all make quick judgments, Judge Wilson. I'm sure I've done the same many times." Her graciousness made him feel even worse. "But I'm in a position where my judgments affect people's lives. Today I only cost you money, but how many other stories have I missed? How many people have I failed to truly see?" Patricia looked at him thoughtfully. "It's never too late to start seeing people differently." Before Judge Wilson could respond, a young man approached Patricia with an urgent message. She excused herself, leaving the judge with his thoughts. Later, as he and Jane drove home, his wife noticed his unusual silence. "What happened between you and Patricia Thompson?" she asked. "I saw you talking." Judge Wilson sighed deeply. "I fined her this morning for a parking violation. Didn't even let her explain why she was in that loading zone." Jane raised an eyebrow. "That must have been an awkward conversation. The strange thing is, she wasn't angry. She was kind. Kinder than I deserved." When they arrived home, Judge Wilson couldn't sleep. He sat in his study looking at old case files. How many stories had he missed? How many people had he judged without truly seeing them? The next morning he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. He asked his clerk to pull Patricia's file and personally wrote a note canceling her fine. It was a small gesture, but it was a start. As he prepared for the day's cases, Judge Wilson made a decision. Today he would listen differently. Today he would try to see the person, not just the offense. And perhaps, just perhaps, he might learn to be not only a fair judge but also a wise one. Part 3. 3 days after the charity dinner, Judge Wilson sat in his office reviewing the day's cases. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. His secretary, Martha, entered. "Judge Wilson, there's a Patricia Thompson here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment." Judge Wilson felt a mix of surprise and nervousness. "Please show her in." A moment later, Patricia entered his office. She wore a simple green dress and carried a folder. "Miss Thompson, please sit down," Judge Wilson said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," Patricia said, taking a seat across from his desk. "Of course. I wanted to tell you that I canceled your fine." Patricia smiled slightly. I received your note, thank you. But that's not why I'm here. She opened her folder and placed a paper on his desk. It was an invitation. The Brighter Future Foundation is hosting a special day at West End Primary School tomorrow. We're opening a new library and computer room for the children. I thought, you might want to see what we do. Judge Wilson picked up the invitation. Why would you want me there? Patricia looked at him directly. Because you're in a position to help many people in this community, and because I believe you want to do what's right. The judge was quiet for a moment. I've been a judge for 40 years, Ms. Thompson. I've always believed I was doing what's right by following the law exactly. The law is important, Patricia agreed. But so are the people the law is meant to serve. Judge Wilson thought about this. What time tomorrow? 10 o'clock. The children have prepared a small performance. The next morning, Judge Wilson found himself outside West End Primary School. It was in the poorest part of town with old brick buildings and a small playground with rusty equipment. He almost turned back to his car, feeling out of place in his suit and tie, but Patricia was waiting at the entrance. Judge Wilson, I'm so glad you came. She led him through hallways decorated with children's artwork. They entered a classroom where 20 children sat on a colorful carpet. Their faces lit up when they saw Patricia. Good morning, Ms. Thompson, they called together. Good morning, children. This is my friend, Judge Wilson. He helps make sure people follow the rules in our town. A small boy raised his hand. Like a police officer? Judge Wilson smiled. Sort of. I decide what happens when people break the rules. Do you put them in jail? Another child asked with wide eyes. Only if they do something very bad, Judge Wilson explained. Most times people just pay a fine or do community service. What's community service? A girl in the front asked. Before he could answer, Patricia said, that's when people help our community instead of paying money. Like when Mr. Baker fixed our playground last month. The children nodded, understanding. After the children performed a song, Patricia showed Judge Wilson the new library room. Bookshelves lined the walls, but many were empty. We're still collecting books, Patricia explained. Many of these children don't have books at home. That's why you were delivering books to the hospital, Judge Wilson realized. Yes. Books open new worlds for children. They continued to the computer room where 5 old computers sat on desks. It's not much, Patricia admitted. But it's a start. Many families here don't have computers or internet. How can children compete in today's world without these tools? As they walked, Judge Wilson saw the reality of life for many people who came through his courtroom. The single mothers working 2 jobs, the fathers taking buses for hours to get to work, the grandparents raising grandchildren on small pensions. Before leaving, Judge Wilson asked Patricia, what does your foundation need most right now? Volunteers, she answered without hesitation. People who care. People with skills to share. On the drive back to the courthouse, Judge Wilson couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. For the first time in years, he felt something changing inside him. A door was opening to a world he had forgotten existed. That afternoon, when a young man stood before him for a minor offense, Judge Wilson did something new. Tell me your story, he said. I want to understand. Part 4. Over the next few weeks, Judge Wilson began to change the way he ran his courtroom. Each morning, he reminded himself to see the person, not just the case number. He started asking questions he had never asked before. Why were you speeding that day? What made you miss your community service hours? Tell me what happened before you parked in that no parking zone. His clerk, George, noticed the change. The judge who once finished 30 cases before lunch now took more time with each person. Some days they only got through 15 cases. But something else was happening too. People left his courtroom looking different, less angry, less defeated. One Thursday, a young woman named Lucy stood before him for missing a payment on her fine. Ms. Bell, you were ordered to pay £50 each month. You missed last month's payment, Judge Wilson said. Yes, Your Honor, Lucy said, looking down at her worn shoes. She was thin, her coat too big for her small frame. Can you tell me why? He asked. Lucy looked surprised at the question. My daughter Emma was sick, Your Honor. She needed medicine. I had to choose between the fine and the medicine. In the past, Judge Wilson would have simply added a late fee. Rules were rules. But now he asked, How old is your daughter? 6, Your Honor. And are you raising her alone? Yes. Her father left when she was 2. Judge Wilson thought for a moment. Ms. Bell, I'm going to offer you an alternative. The Brighter Future Foundation needs volunteers at West End Primary School. You can work off your fine by helping there for 10 hours. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. Really? I can do that. Thank you. After court that day, Judge Wilson called Patricia. I hope you don't mind, he said after explaining about Lucy. I should have asked you first. Not at all, Patricia replied. In fact, we need more volunteers. Would you consider making this a regular option for people who can't pay their fines? I would need to create a formal program, Judge Wilson said, thinking out loud. Get approval from the court administrator. I could help you write the proposal, Patricia offered. 2 days later, they met at a small cafe to work on the idea. Judge Wilson brought legal papers, and Patricia brought stories of people who could benefit. They worked for hours, their coffee growing cold as they talked. As weeks passed, they continued meeting to develop the program. Sometimes they met at the courthouse, sometimes at the foundation office. Each time, Judge Wilson learned more about the challenges facing people in his community. He visited a shelter where single mothers lived with their children. He went to a food bank where elderly people came for meals. He saw the small apartments, where large families shared 1 or 2 rooms. How did I not see all this before? And he asked Patricia one day as they left a community center. We often see what we're looking for, she answered. You were looking for rule breakers, so that's what you saw. And what are you looking for? He asked. Patricia smiled. People trying their best in difficult situations. At home, Judge Wilson's wife noticed the change in him. He talked more at dinner, sharing stories about people he met through Patricia's foundation. He started checking local news instead of just reading legal journals. You seem different, Jane said one evening as they walked in the park. Do I? He asked. Happier, she said. More alive. Judge Wilson thought about this. 6 weeks ago, he had been so sure about everything. Right and wrong, good and bad. Now life seemed more complicated, but also more real. That night, he sat at his desk at home, looking at a photo Patricia had given him. It showed children in the new library room, their faces bright with excitement as they held books. In the E corner, he could see Lucy, Emma's mother, helping a small boy find a book. One simple choice, to listen rather than judge, had started something he couldn't have imagined. And for the first time in many years, Judge Wilson felt truly useful. Part 5. 3 months after their first meeting at the charity dinner, Judge Wilson sat in the town hall meeting room. Around him were police officers, social workers, teachers, and business owners. Patricia stood at the front explaining their new program, Second Chance. When someone receives a fine they can't pay, they can now choose community service instead, Patricia explained. They might help at schools, clean parks, or assist at the food bank. This helps our community and gives people a chance to make things right. Judge Wilson watched the faces in the room. Some looked interested, others doubtful. The police chief, Officer Thomas, raised his hand. How do we know people will actually do the work? Each person signs in and out at their service location, Judge Wilson answered. We have supervisors at each site. In the first month, 95% of people completed their hours. Mayor Brown spoke next. And what happens to the money the court would have collected from fines? We still collect fines from those who can pay, Judge Wilson explained. But many fines went unpaid anyway. People simply couldn't afford them. Then they would get in more trouble for not paying. An older woman in the back stood up. She was a teacher at West End School. I want to say that this program has brought us wonderful volunteers. They read to the children, helped in the lunchroom, and even fixed our playground. The children love having them. As the meeting continued, Judge Wilson thought about how much had changed. The program had started small, with just 5 people choosing community service instead of fines. Now 30 people each week joined the program. Even more surprising was the change in his own life. He now visited West End School every Friday to read to the children. He knew the names of the volunteers at the food bank. He had dinner once a week with Patricia to talk about new ideas for their program. After the meeting, Mayor Brown approached him. "Wilson, I've known you for 20 years. I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" Judge Wilson asked. "Passionate about something outside the law," the mayor replied with a smile. Later that day, Judge Wilson returned to his courtroom. A young man named David stood before him for driving without a license. "Mr. Parker, can you tell me why you were driving without a license?" Judge Wilson asked. "My license was suspended 6 months ago because I couldn't pay a parking ticket," David explained. "But yesterday my wife went into labor. I had to get her to the hospital." Judge Wilson looked at the young man. 5 months ago, he would have simply applied the fine for driving without a license. Rules were rules. "How is your wife? And the baby?" he asked instead. David's face brightened. "They're both doing well. We have a daughter. We named her Hope." Judge Wilson smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Then he made his decision. "Mr. Parker, driving without a license is serious. However, I understand the emergency situation. Here's what we'll do. You'll enter the Second Chance program and complete 20 hours of community service. We'll also help you get your license back." "Thank you, Your Honor," David said, his voice filled with relief. That evening, Judge Wilson walked through the park on his way home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He sat on a bench, watching children play, on the swings while their parents chatted nearby. A small girl ran past him chasing a ball. She stopped suddenly and picked up something from the ground. Coming back to where Judge Wilson sat, she held out her hand. In her palm was a small white flower. "For you," she said with a smile, placing it in his hand before running back to her friends. Judge Wilson looked at the simple flower and felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was what Patricia had been trying to show him all along. Behind every case was a person. Behind every rule, a reason, and sometimes the greatest wisdom came not from strict judgment, but from seeing with the heart. He tucked the flower into his pocket and started for home, already thinking about tomorrow's cases and the stories he would hear. Stories of people trying their best in a difficult world. Stories that finally he was ready to hear.